There are 14 black garbage bags sitting in the grass outside the Lincoln Park apartment right now, and one of them has a zipper on it. The bag my mother chose for the blue blazer I'd bought for job interviews, the one she'd actually complimented 3 years ago at Christmas dinner. She'd looked at me in that blazer and said, for once, that I looked put together. I remember that compliment because I had collected them the way you collect rare coins. You polish each one. You keep it somewhere safe. You take it out when you need proof that what you think of yourself has some basis in reality. That bag is sitting against the curb now, slouched over like it's embarrassed to be outside, and the November wind is doing something violent to everything I own. Let me take you back to the beginning, because what happened that November evening in Chicago didn't start on that lawn. It started years before, in the architecture of a family where love had always come with fine print, where approval was dispensed in small rations and withheld like water in a drought, where a mother looked at her daughter and saw, above everything else, a risk, a liability, a woman who needed managing. My name is Claire. I'm 29 years old. And this is the story of the day my mother tried to reduce me to nothing and accidentally proved that I'd never needed her at all. Chicago in November is a specific kind of cold. It's not just temperature, it's atmospheric, like the city itself has made a decision about you. The wind comes off Lake Michigan with an attitude, cutting through whatever you're wearing, finding the gaps in your coat collar, the space between your glove and your sleeve. People who live here don't talk about it the way tourists do. Locals don't romanticize it. They just manage it, the way you manage anything that's always been part of your life. You dress for it. You lean into it. You keep moving. I'd been moving through Chicago for 7 years by that point. Came for graduate school, stayed for work, got my master's in social work from Loyola, passed my LCSW exam on the first try, landed a position at the Department of Child and Family Services. Not glamorous, not lucrative, but work that mattered in ways I could trace directly from my actions to someone else's life improving, which was more than most people could say about their jobs. I'd been doing it for 4 years, building case files, showing up in court, navigating a system that ground families down like gears and trying to introduce small saving graces into the machinery. Marcus entered my life at a fundraiser for a children's hospital on the North Shore. He was tall, good-looking in a way that photographs well, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to wonder about money. His family owned 6 car dealerships scattered across the Chicago suburbs, the kind of business that doesn't make headlines, but generates the kind of wealth that shows up quietly in the form of European vacations and restaurant reservations you don't make weeks in advance. He smiled at me across a room full of people dressed for photographs, and I thought, here is a person who exists in a completely different atmosphere than mine. And that felt, at 26, like an adventure rather than a warning. We dated for 8 months before he told his parents about me. I understood that, even then. His world had its own pace of acceptance, its own vetting process. The first time he brought me to the family home in Naperville, a house that announced its success through the particular confidence of a well-maintained driveway and a garage that could fit 4 cars. I wore the blue blazer and sat at a table where the silverware matched and watched his father carve roast beef with the precision of a man who had carved roast beef at the head of this table for 30 years. His mother asked me about my work with the lightness of someone who had already decided the answer was charming but not threatening. When I explained family court, she nodded with a smile that said, "How noble." What I didn't understand then was that Marcus's family had their own architecture, just as elaborate and controlling as my mother's, just better dressed. His father was a man who had built things and expected them to continue being built according to his specifications. His mother was warmth deployed strategically. She was generous when generosity cost nothing, and silent when it would. The dealership business was the central fact of their identity. 6 locations, 400 employees, the name on highway signs. Everything else organized around it, including their son. Marcus himself was charming in the way people are charming when they've never needed to be otherwise. When doors open for you before you arrive, there's no occasion to develop the skill of opening them yourself. He was funny and present and genuinely kind about things that didn't cost him anything. But I had built the habit, by 26, of ignoring the small warnings that arrived alongside the things I wanted. The way he deflected when I asked about his finances. The way certain conversations ended before they started. The way he looked at me differently in his family's house than he did in mine, like I was a version of myself he was still calibrating for presentation. I noticed these things. I noted them and filed them in a drawer I didn't open. That is its own kind of mistake, and I have made my peace with it. My mother thought Marcus was the best thing I'd ever done. That's not hyperbole. She literally said those words. He's the best decision you've ever made, as though I were a stock portfolio and Marcus was a blue-chip acquisition. She'd never loved my career choice. She'd wanted law school, had wanted the kind of trajectory that announced itself on Christmas cards and at dinner parties. Social work registered in her mind as a vague disappointment, a choice made by people who weren't quite brave enough for ambition. She tolerated my job the way you tolerate a relative's harmless eccentricity. But Marcus, she understood. Marcus represented upward movement, and upward movement was the only direction my mother respected. So you need to understand what it meant in that household, in that family logic, that Marcus and I were engaged. To my mother, it was a validation, not of me exactly, more of her own patience. She'd waited through my social work years, through my thrift store dresses, through the apartment in Rogers Park I'd lived in before Marcus, with its radiator that clanged all winter and the neighbor who played accordion at 11 at night. She'd waited, and now here was the payoff. Her daughter, engaged to Marcus Whitfield, whose family name appeared on dealership signs you could see from the highway. She'd exhaled, she'd relaxed, and she'd started treating me, for the first time in my memory, as though I'd finally become acceptable. The 8 months before the engagement were the warmest of my adult relationship with her. She called on Sunday mornings, always around 10, when she knew I'd be awake and Marcus might be there, as though his presence was the variable that made the call worth making. She asked about the wedding planning with a focus and enthusiasm she'd never applied to anything I'd done before. She had opinions about venues and invitations and the merits of various caterers in a way that would have irritated me at any other time, but felt, in the context of her actually engaging with my life, like sustenance. I remember one Sunday in particular. She called while Marcus and I were making breakfast in the Lincoln Park apartment, and I put her on speaker, and she and Marcus talked for 20 minutes about the guest list while I made eggs and listened to them laugh together over something I'd missed the beginning of. Afterward, when we'd hung up, Marcus said, "I like your mother." And I felt something complicated in my chest, gratitude and grief simultaneously. The gratitude for having something I'd always wanted, the grief for understanding how conditional it was. This warmth was for Marcus's benefit. It was on loan from his approval, but I took it, because it was the warmest thing available, and that's what you do with warmth when you haven't had enough of it. You take what's offered. You tell yourself it's the real thing. You don't examine too closely the scaffolding it's built on, because if you pull at it, the whole structure comes down. My mother had conditioned me, over 29 years, to accept the warmth on whatever terms it arrived, and I had never built a sufficient wall against the relief of receiving it. That's the height I was standing at when she hired the private investigator. I want you to sit with that for a second. The relationship I'm describing, the fragile warmth, the finally being seen, that's what made what she did so specifically devastating. It wasn't just an accusation. It was the withdrawal of something I'd waited my entire life to receive. She'd handed me belonging and then snatched it back with both hands. And the whiplash of it was a kind of violence I still don't have adequate words for. Her name is Patricia. She's 61 years old, sharp-boned, with the kind of posture that reads as confidence until you know her well enough to recognize it as control. She grew up in Oak Park, married my father at 23, lost him to a heart attack when I was 15. She'd raised my brother and me after that, with a combination of fierce efficiency and emotional architecture that left very little room for anything she hadn't approved in advance. My brother Thomas had gone to Northwestern for business school and now worked in finance in New York. He'd followed the blueprint. I'd deviated from it. That deviation had never fully healed. She hired the investigator in September. I didn't know that then. I was working, handling a caseload of 43 active families, preparing a report for a juvenile court hearing, and planning a wedding for the following June. The invitations were designed. The venue was booked, a restored church hall in Wicker Park with exposed beams and the kind of lighting that makes everyone look like they're worth more than they are. I'd found my dress at a small boutique in Andersonville, ivory with a simple cut that didn't require a metaphor to feel beautiful. I'd also been volunteering on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for 6 weeks at a temporary shelter the county had established in a converted extended stay America in Schaumburg. This had come through work. My supervisor had flagged it as a community partnership opportunity, asked if anyone was available, and I'd raised my hand because the shelter was serving women leaving domestic violence situations, and I had skills that were directly applicable. I was running resume workshops, teaching basic job application processes, helping women who'd spent years having their identity eroded by someone who claimed to love them rebuild a sense of what they were capable of on paper. The irony of that is something I've had considerable time to appreciate. A private investigator named Dennis Farrow had been watching me for 6 weeks. He'd photographed me entering that hotel in Schaumburg 11 times. He'd compiled 273 photographs, timestamps, location logs, a detailed written report. He'd charged my mother $4,800 for this work, a significant portion of which, it would later emerge, he had fabricated entirely. 6 of the 11 documented dates were invented, his billing hours were inflated, and he had apparently decided that actually verifying the nature of my hotel visits was not a necessary step in the process of constructing a narrative that confirmed what his client already believed. He gave her what she'd paid for. Evidence of betrayal, manufactured with professional-grade tools and an absence of anything resembling professional ethics. My mother received his report on a Tuesday morning. By 3 that afternoon, she had shared it with Marcus. By 5 that evening, she was standing in my doorway while Marcus stood behind her holding a manila folder like a warrant, and my belongings were in 14 black garbage bags on the front lawn of the Lincoln Park apartment I'd lived in for 3 years. That's how fast a life can be restructured by someone who decided the verdict before examining the evidence. Let me tell you what that walk up the front path felt like. I'd taken the Red Line home from work, then the bus west on Fullerton, a commute I'd done hundreds of times, so automatic that my body did it while my mind was still at the office, still with the juvenile court report, still with the family I'd visited that morning in Humboldt Park, a mother trying to get her kids back, a woman fighting the current of a system that moved slow and judged fast. I walked up the front path with my work bag on my shoulder, thinking about a 7-year-old named Marcus, who needed his mother to have stable housing by December. And then I saw the bags, 14 of them, lined up in the grass and along the sidewalk with the kind of deliberate arrangement that communicated intention. This was not an accident. This was a statement. The blue blazer bag leaning against the curb, the bag with my graduate school textbooks stretching at the bottom because no one had thought to consider that hardcovers are heavy and garbage bags are not architecture. A bag with my throw blanket visible through a small tear at the corner. The blanket I'd bought at a craft fair in Evanston from a woman who'd told me the pattern was traditional, and I'd believed her because I wanted to. My mother was in the doorway, arms crossed over her gray wool coat, her face arranged into the particular expression she used when she'd made a decision and was prepared to defend it indefinitely. Behind her, through the narrow gap of space she occupied, I could see Marcus, the manila folder, his jaw set like he'd rehearsed how to hold it. The wind came off the lake and went through my work blazer like it wasn't there. "You don't live here anymore," my mother said. I remember how flat her voice was, not angry. Anger would have implied she expected better. This was verdict, delivered from on high by someone who had always suspected the worst and had finally secured her justification. Marcus has seen the proof. She took one small step forward. You're exactly what I always suspected. A liar who can't keep her legs closed. 8 words. Or 12, depending on how you count. I've counted them many times since. There's what happens to your body when words like that arrive, and there's what happens a half-second later when your mind catches up to what your body already knows. The first thing was my chest, something tightening in there like a fist closing around the mechanism that makes air move in and out. Then my hands going cold, not from the November wind, from the inside. Then the narrowing of everything, the way the lawn and the bags and the neighbors slowing their evening walks to watch all collapsed into the space between me and my mother's face. I understood, in that physical way you understand things before you have words for them, that she had not discovered something. She had constructed something. She had decided, and then built evidence around her decision. And she was now presenting the construction as reality. Mom, if you'd just let me... I don't want to hear it. She stepped back. Marcus closed the door. The deadbolt clicked with a sound that was entirely too small for what it meant, a sound barely louder than a cabinet latch, announcing the end of 3 years, the end of a June wedding, the end of the warmth I'd spent my whole life trying to earn. The neighbors kept walking. The wind kept coming. Somewhere on the block, a dog was barking at something it didn't understand. I stood on that front path for what felt like an hour but was probably 4 minutes, and I want you to understand what I was feeling, because it wasn't what most people might assume. It wasn't rage. Not yet. It was something more foundational than rage. A kind of dislocation, like I'd reached for the floor and found nothing there. Because the apartment was where I lived. The man behind that door was who I'd planned to marry. And the woman who'd just pronounced me a liar and shut the door was the person who was supposed to have known me longest, who was supposed to hold the longest thread of evidence for who I actually was. She'd just told me that thread had never existed, that what I'd believed was knowledge was always only suspicion, waiting for confirmation. I picked up 2 of the 14 bags, loaded them into the trunk of my Honda Civic, which was parked half a block down, came back for 2 more. Neighbors were inside by then. The ones who'd slowed had made their calculations and moved on. There was dinner to make, kids to manage, their own complicated lives to attend to. I loaded 14 garbage bags into and around a 2015 Honda Civic in 4 trips, in November in Chicago, in a work blazer that wasn't warm enough, and then I drove away from the Lincoln Park apartment and didn't know where I was going. I drove north on Clark Street for 20 minutes without destination, which is what you do when the architecture of your life has just been removed and your body still has its own momentum. Then I pulled into a parking lot near Montrose Beach and sat in the car with the engine running for heat, watching the lake through the windshield, and tried to calculate something useful. This is what I knew. I had $127 in my checking account. The $12 union dollars I'd saved over 4 years of careful budgeting had been contributed to the down payment on the apartment. Marcus's name on the lease, my money in the walls. My mother had co-signed that lease to help us secure it. My name was not on it. I had no legal claim to the space I'd furnished, paid for, and lived in for 3 years. I had 14 garbage bags. I had a 2015 Honda Civic. I had a job. I had $127. You know what they don't tell you about sleeping in your car in Chicago in November? How the cold doesn't come from one direction. It seeps, the way water works through fabric, finding every gap between the cushion and the door seal, coming up through the floorboards, coming down through the metal of the roof. How the sounds outside are amplified in a way they never are inside a building, so every passing car is an event, every voice on the sidewalk a potential assessment of your situation. How morning arrives with your body having been unconscious but not rested, cramped into geometries you didn't design for sleeping, your neck having made its own architectural decisions without consulting you. I woke at 5 a.m. with frost on the inside of my windows. Not the outside, the inside. the condensation of my own breath, frozen against the glass like an argument I hadn't made yet. The first call I made was to my brother Thomas in New York. I got his voicemail. I left a message that was careful and factual, and only broke once, briefly, in the middle. And I'm still not sure he ever listened to the whole thing, because he texted me 3 days later saying he'd heard about what happened, and he was sure there was more to the story, but he didn't want to get in the middle. Thomas was good at staying out of the middle. He'd spent his whole life perfecting that particular skill. The second call was to my friend Renata, who I'd met in graduate school and who now lived in Logan Square with her wife and a large orange cat. Renata answered on the second ring, listened to everything I said in 3 minutes, and then said, "You're coming here tonight." I said I didn't want to impose. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "Claire, you slept in your car in November in Chicago. You are coming here tonight. If you argue with me, I'm coming to find you." I spent 3 nights with Renata and her wife before I found the room in Albany Park. Those 3 nights were a different kind of education than the car. They were about watching people live normally when your own normal has been removed. Renata made dinner. Her wife Simone made tea and asked quiet questions. They didn't pressure me to process everything immediately. They just kept the house warm and the refrigerator stocked and treated me like a person who'd had something terrible happen rather than a person who'd somehow caused it. The first night, Renata didn't push me to talk. She made pasta, something simple, with garlic and olive oil, the kind of meal that doesn't require much thought to cook or to eat, and we sat at her kitchen table while her cat moved between our chairs, and the city hummed outside through the windows of her Logan Square apartment. Her wife Simone came home at 9 and registered my presence with a directness that was also somehow gentle. She sat down across from me, poured herself a glass of wine, and said, "Tell me what you need right now and I'll tell you if we have it." What I needed was warmth and food and a locked door between me and November, and all of those things were present. I said this. Simone nodded and refilled my water glass. The second night was harder, because the body had started to process what the first night had given it space from, and processing is not comfortable. I woke at 3 in the morning in their guest room with my heart going too fast and my mind replaying the front path, the bags, my mother's voice, the deadbolt. I lay in the borrowed dark and ran through the same sequence of facts. What I had, what I didn't have, what was gone, what remained. What remained was my job, my credentials, my car, my training. That list was thinner than it should have been at 29, and it was also, I made myself see this even at 3 in the morning with my heart wrong, not nothing. On the third morning, Renata sat down across from me at breakfast and put a key on the table. "For as long as you need," she said. "There's no clock on this." I looked at the key, a copy of her front door key, cut specifically, the weight of a deliberate act rather than an obligation, and understood it for what it was. Not pity, but the specific dignity of being treated as someone who deserved resources while they rebuilt. I kept that key for 2 months after I'd found the Albany Park room. I'm not sure I could have explained why, except that some things you keep not for use but for evidence of what kindness looks like when it arrives without an agenda. But the social machinery had already moved. By the second day, my mother had texted Marcus's brother, who had told his girlfriend, who had told half of our social circle. The story, as it traveled, achieved the crystallization that rumors always do when they move fast through a community that trusts their source. My mother's word was currency in our circle. She'd spent 30 years building a reputation for judgment and discernment, and she was cashing it in on me. 23 messages over 2 days, coffee dates canceled, book club invitations rescinded, brunch plans dissolved. A few of them even explained their reasoning, which was almost worse. I just think it's best to give you space right now. I hope you get the help you need. One person, a woman I'd helped move apartments 3 years ago because she'd asked and I'd said yes without hesitation, sent me a message that said simply, "I'm disappointed in you." Not one of them asked for my side. Not one of them. In 23 messages said, "Tell me what actually happened." There were 23 messages over 2 days. But there were also the silences. The people who didn't message at all, whose quietness was its own statement. A woman named Julia, who I'd known since my second year at DCFS, and with whom I'd had lunch every few weeks for 3 years. Every first Friday of the month at a Thai restaurant on Milwaukee Avenue, the same order every time, pad see UW and jasmine tea, and the kind of friendship that builds in the aggregate of repeated small rituals. Julia didn't message. She simply stopped. The lunch invitation stopped. The texts that had come every week or so, small exchanges about cases and weekends and a book she was reading, those stopped too, mid-thread, as though our conversation had been suspended at a moment she didn't choose and then never resumed. There was also a woman named Bev, who'd been in my graduate school cohort and had shown up at my apartment with food when my cat died in my second year of work. I'd had a cat in the Rogers Park apartment, a gray tabby named Professor who'd been with me for 6 years, and who'd required, at the end, more veterinary attention than I could really afford. Bev had shown up with soup and bad television and stayed until I laughed about something, which was the correct response to grief and which I'd never forgotten. When the 23 messages came and Bev's was not among them, I sat with the absence of it for a long time. That was the one that cost the most. Not because she owed me a defense. No one owes you a defense. That's not how friendship works. But because I'd believed, based on the soup and the bad television and the gray tabby, that we were the kind of people who asked before we judged. I want to pause here and acknowledge something, because I think it's important. In the days right after, I spent considerable energy being hurt by that, by the speed of their departure, the efficiency of their abandonment. I cataloged each message, each name, each prior interaction that now seemed to have been auditioned for exactly this moment of desertion. I was 29 years old, living out of a car and then a borrowed couch, eating gas station protein bars for breakfast because I couldn't afford real breakfast. And I was also, simultaneously, being workshopped out of my social life. But here's what I've come to understand about that particular hurt. It was real, and it was also clarifying. Every person who sent one of those 23 messages was telling me something useful. They were telling me what our relationship was actually worth, measured at the moment when measuring mattered most. They were showing me the load-bearing walls and helping me understand, for the first time, which ones had never been real. I kept going to work. What else was I going to do? I showered at the 24-hour gym where I'd maintained a $39 monthly membership. Money I couldn't afford, but couldn't sacrifice because maintaining basic hygiene was the single most important variable in my ability to continue functioning professionally. I kept spare blazers in my car trunk. I bought dollar store deodorant and learned which gas stations had the cleanest bathrooms and which Starbucks locations were least likely to notice how long I nursed a small coffee. I ate gas station protein bars for breakfast, and whatever free food appeared in the office break room, leftover birthday cake, cold bagels, the occasional meeting tray that hadn't been entirely demolished. Dinner was, often, not a thing. I was at work. I was functioning. I was bathed and pressed and showing up on time with my case files current and my reports filed. None of my colleagues knew. I made sure none of them knew because I understood, with an animal instinct, that the story was not done yet, that if I needed to fight, and I suspected I would need to fight, I needed the fight to find me as something other than a woman who'd been dismantled. The performance was continuous and total. I'd spent years developing the professional face, the one you wear in family court, at child welfare meetings, in the windowless rooms where you tell a mother that the judge has ruled against her, a face that communicates, I am functional, I am clear, I can hold this. That face had been built for the benefit of clients, people in genuine crisis who needed someone stable across the table from them. I had not anticipated needing to wear it for myself. There was a Tuesday, 3 weeks in, when a colleague asked me what was wrong. We were in the copy room, and she'd looked at me in the way someone looks when they've been watching something accumulate over days and have finally decided to say something. Her name was Patricia, a different Patricia, not my mother. And she was 10 years older than me and had been in the system long enough to have seen most of what it could do to people. She asked with the particular gentleness of someone who isn't sure the question is welcome. I said I was fine, just tired. I said it with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment, because I had. She looked at me for 2 beats longer than necessary, then nodded and left with her copies. 2 days later, there was a sandwich on my desk when I came back from a home visit. Turkey, from the deli across the street, with a napkin and nothing written on it. She never mentioned it. I ate it at my desk between reports, and the simple act of someone having seen what I was hiding and responded with a sandwich rather than a question, the discretion of it, the practical kindness, was the thing that almost broke my careful face. I kept it together, but I ate that sandwich like it was important. Because it was. On day 5 of the new reality, I spent 18 minutes in the parking lot of a Target on Peterson Avenue calculating whether I could afford a $3.79 box of tampons. I ran the numbers forward and backward. I had $98 in my account at that point. The gym membership would draft in 4 days. I had a tank of gas and needed another one by the weekend. The math was surgical and humiliating and arrived after 18 minutes at the conclusion that I could afford the tampons if I did not also buy the other thing I'd planned to buy, which was a can of soup. I bought the tampons. I didn't buy the soup. Then I sat in my car in the Target parking lot and allowed myself, for exactly 12 minutes, to cry. Not about the tampons or the soup specifically. About the $12,000 I'd contributed to a down payment on an apartment that had locked me out. About the June wedding that had been canceled so efficiently that the venue deposit was already forfeited. About the fact that I'd once had a savings account with real money in it, accumulated over 4 years of careful choices, and it was gone. About my mother standing in a doorway telling me I was exactly what she'd always suspected. 12 minutes. Then I wiped my face, started the car, and drove to Renata's to pick up the spare key she'd had cut for me. Here's what I need you to understand about those first 8 days. They were as bad as they sound. I am not going to minimize the car and the frost and the protein bars and the 18 minutes in the Target parking lot. Those things happened. They left marks. They taught me things about fear and resourcefulness and the specific texture of humiliation that I would not have learned any other way. But bottom is also flat. And when you're standing on something flat, you can finally see clearly in every direction. On day 8, sitting in my car behind a 7-Eleven in Rogers Park at 9 o'clock in the evening, eating a bag of peanuts I'd bought because I was out of protein bars, I remembered something my supervisor had mentioned 3 months ago. Almost offhandedly, the way important things are often introduced, not with fanfare, just dropped into conversation while we were both walking to the parking garage after a long Tuesday. The county was contracting out case management work, reviewing family court files, writing reports for judges, helping clear a backlog that had grown to 847 cases. She'd mentioned it and then asked, with the general air of someone who knew the answer was no but was required to ask. Did I know anyone with clinical social work experience who might want freelance income? I sat in that parking lot behind the 7-Eleven in Rogers Park and heard that sentence again as though she'd just spoken it. I had clinical social work experience. I had my LCSW, the Licensed Clinical Social Worker credential, which took 2 years of supervised clinical hours after graduate school to earn, which I had passed on the first attempt, which was framed and hanging on a wall in the Lincoln Park apartment I no longer had access to. I had 7 years of navigating the exact systems these cases moved through. I knew the language of family court reports, the structure that judges relied on, the way a well-constructed case review could cut through the noise of a contested custody situation and give a decision-maker something they could actually use. I picked up my phone. At 9:45 at night, on day 8 of sleeping in my car, I composed an email to my supervisor asking if the contract work was still available. I sent it. Then I ate the rest of my peanuts and decided to find parking somewhere warmer. She responded at 6:17 the following morning. How soon can you start? There are moments when information arrives and your body processes it before your mind does. My hands went warm. My chest opened. Something that had been locked down for 8 days shifted. Not dramatically, not with any sound, just a quiet interior movement that was, I recognized even in the moment, the first thing that had moved in the right direction since November. The county paid $85 per completed case review. They had immediate need for 30 reviews, with more coming weekly as the backlog continued to accumulate. I could work from anywhere with my laptop and database access. No office required. No specific hours. Just the work, completed with sufficient quality to hold up to judicial review, submitted through the secure portal. I completed my first review in a Starbucks on Clark Street in Lincoln Square, nursing a small coffee for 3 hours in a corner seat by the window while Chicago did what Chicago does in November. Moved fast, dressed for it, kept going. The case was a contested custody situation involving a father with a documented history of substance use and a mother who'd relocated twice in 8 months. I read the file. I thought about the 7-year-old at the center of it. I wrote 12 pages. The structure felt familiar. It felt like the part of me that had survived intact, the part that didn't require anyone else's validation to function. This was what I'd trained for. This was what I was good at. Not through anyone's approval, not because Marcus's family owned dealerships, or my mother had decided I'd finally made the right choice, but because I'd spent 7 years learning how to do it well. The work was what it was regardless of the 14 garbage bags. The training didn't leave when everything else did. There is a specific kind of clarity that arrives when you're doing work that genuinely requires everything you have. I had written thousands of pages in my career, reports, assessments, case notes, court submissions, but those pages had been written from within a life that had scaffolding around it. The scaffolding of the apartment and the relationship and the social circle and my mother's conditional approval. All of that had been removed, and what I found underneath was not diminished. The analysis was the same analysis. The skill of reading a case file and understanding which facts were legally relevant, which details would land with a judge, which gaps needed filling, and which could be acknowledged and set aside. That was mine. That had always been mine. I finished the 12 pages at 2:47 in the afternoon. The Starbucks had cycled through several groups of people by then, the morning coffee crowd, the laptop workers, the lunch rush, and now the mid-afternoon lull when the place quieted and the baristas moved slower and the light through the windows changed from morning white to afternoon gold. I read the review once through, made 3 small corrections, and submitted it through the secure portal. Then I sat with my empty cup and felt something I want to describe carefully, because it's easy to overstate it. Not pride. Exactly. Not joy. Something quieter and more structural than either of those. The feeling of a load-bearing wall that has been tested and has held. I had done what I was trained to do. I had done it well enough that I could see it was good, measuring it against the standard of my own knowledge rather than someone else's approval. That measurement was new. I had been trained, over a lifetime, to measure quality through external confirmation, and for the first time I was using a different instrument. It was awkward and slightly vertiginous, like using muscles you've never isolated before. But it worked. The measurement was clear. I ordered another coffee. The barista who'd stopped noticing me hours ago glanced up, made it, set it on the counter without a word. I went back to my table by the window. Chicago kept moving outside. I submitted the first review on a Thursday morning and received payment confirmation the following Tuesday. $85. Then I submitted another. Then another. 8 reviews in the first week. $680. Enough for the security deposit on a room. I found it on Craigslist on a Friday afternoon, a furnished bedroom in a 3-flat in Albany Park, $600 a month including utilities, available immediately, Landlady named Elena, who was 63 and had been renting rooms for 20 years, and had the weathered practicality of someone who'd heard every story and simply wanted reliable tenants. She asked me one question when I met her on the front porch with cash in my pocket. "Can you pay first month and deposit today?" "Yes," I said. "Okay," she said, and handed me the key. I moved in that afternoon. 14 garbage bags in a strange bedroom with furniture that wasn't mine, on a bed that wasn't a car seat, in a building where the radiator worked and the windows sealed and the cold stayed outside where it belonged. I sat on that bed and cried for 20 minutes, not from sadness exactly, but from the specific relief of a body that had been braced for too long finally releasing. I was off the street. I was somewhere. That was everything, and it was also just the beginning. The second month, I completed 24 case reviews while still working my full-time caseload at DCFS. I was sleeping 4 hours a night. I was writing reports until 2 in the morning, the laptop open on the small desk in my borrowed bedroom, the Chicago nightscape visible through the window, the radiator keeping a low, steady rhythm. My eyes were regularly bloodshot. My social life was non-existent by choice. I had neither the time nor the emotional reserves for navigating what had happened to my friendships, and I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I didn't miss it. What I'd had wasn't community. It was proximity. And proximity was not the same thing. I was eating real food again. I'd opened a new bank account at a credit union on Lawrence Avenue that my mother had no access to, no knowledge of, no history with. I'd bought interview clothes from the Goodwill on Ashland. Good ones, a blazer that fit properly, pants with a real crease. I was watching my checking account develop a number that went up instead of down. I didn't tell people what had happened. Not at work. Not in Albany Park. Not at the Starbucks where I'd become a regular presence on weekend mornings with my laptop and my growing database of case files. There was a middle-aged man there who always sat at the counter by the window, working on what appeared to be architectural drawings. We'd developed the comfortable acknowledgement of regulars, a nod. Occasionally, a brief observation about the weather, the kind of connection that asks nothing and offers something small and genuine. One morning, he looked at my screen, at the case file open on it, and said, "Family law?" "Social work," I said. "Case reviews." He nodded thoughtfully, the way someone nods when they're connecting something. "My sister does something similar in Indianapolis," he said. "She says the judges who get good reviewers assigned to their dockets defend those reviewers like their family." I thought about that for a long time after he went back to his drawings. The third month, the county offered me a direct contract. 40 cases monthly, $95 per case, with potential for expansion depending on quality metrics. Nearly $4,000 a month on top of my salary. They'd been impressed, the coordinator told me, by both the quality of my work and the speed of my turnaround. Family court judges, who are among the more overworked professionals in the Illinois court system, don't have time for reviewers who pad their analysis or bury their conclusions. My reports were specific, sourced, clearly reasoned, and delivered on time. Judges were beginning to request my work by name. I want to tell you what that felt like, because the feeling matters to what happened next. It didn't feel like vindication. Not yet. It felt like information. Like someone handing you a map and saying, "This is what you're capable of. This is the terrain. You've been walking it without knowing it." My value had existed before my mother hired the private investigator. It would have existed without Marcus or the Lincoln Park apartment or the June wedding. I had just needed the scaffolding removed to discover what had always been the structure. By month 4, I had $300 in savings. I moved out of the Albany Park room into a one-bedroom apartment in Ravenswood with hardwood floors and a dishwasher and windows that looked onto a quiet residential street where an elderly man walked his dog every evening at 7. I bought a bed frame. I bought a coffee maker that was not the gas station kind. I was sleeping 6 hours a night, which felt, after the previous months, like an almost inexplicable luxury. The county had increased my contract to 50 cases monthly, and asked me to train 2 new reviewers. That request stopped me in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon because it meant something specific. They didn't just need my work, they needed my method. They needed me to teach other people how to do what I did. I had become, without entirely noticing, something more than a contractor. I had become a resource. There's something that happens when competence becomes visible. The world doesn't change, but your position within it does. Judges mentioned my name in hearings. My supervisor told me this, slightly wide-eyed, the way you are when something exceeds expectation. Attorneys who worked family court cases started making requests. One of them, a woman who did mostly pro bono custody work on the North Side, called me directly to ask if I'd be available for a consultation on a complicated case she was building. She found my number through the county coordinator and called on a Wednesday afternoon with the direct confidence of someone accustomed to finding the people she needed. "I've been told your analysis is unusually clear," she said. "I want someone who can explain a complex family dynamic to a judge in 3 paragraphs." We met for coffee at a restaurant near the courthouse. She was precise, fast-talking, the kind of lawyer who thinks in structures and can spot a weak argument at 20 paces. She told me, over an Americano, that good case review work was chronically undervalued and routinely performed by people who didn't fully understand how it was read by judges. She said my reports read like they were written by someone who understood both sides of the bench. She asked where I'd trained. I told her. She nodded like she was filing it. "You should be charging more," she said. "I'm charging what the county offers," I said. "The county's rate is the floor, not the ceiling," she said. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I went back to my Ravenswood apartment that evening and sat at my kitchen table. The new table. The one I'd bought at a secondhand furniture store on Lawrence Avenue, and refinished myself over 2 weekends with sandpaper and a borrowed sander, and looked at the number in my contract spreadsheet. The county rate. The floor, not the ceiling. I'd accepted it without question, the way you accept what you're offered when you're coming from nothing. When $85 was the number that had meant the difference between a warm room and a car seat. But I wasn't coming from nothing anymore. I was coming from demonstrated value, from a record of work that was making its way through 7 county court systems and being requested by name. I spent that evening researching, not rates exactly, those aren't published for this kind of contract work, but value indicators. What did it mean when a judge requested a specific reviewer? What was the market for expert case analysis in family court proceedings outside the county contract structure? The attorney had called me directly, had found my number through a coordinator, had specifically sought me out for a complicated case rather than asking the county to assign someone. That was a data point. I drafted an email to the county coordinator that night. Polite, factual, specific. My current rate, the increase I was requesting, the justification in concrete terms, number of counties served, judicial feedback received, training work performed. I sent it before I could revise it into timidity. The coordinator called me the next morning. "I was expecting this," she said. "Yes. Sometimes the floor moves up because you ask it to. My supervisor submitted my case review work for the state's Excellence in Social Work Practice Award in January. I didn't win. I was a finalist, one of 5 in all of Illinois, which covered thousands of practitioners. I read the notification email 3 times. Then I forwarded it to my brother Thomas, who had never listened to my voicemail, with no message attached. He texted back, "Wow, that's great." Then nothing else. But that's a different story, and Thomas is not the one this story is about. Will County called in February, DuPage County in March. Their family court dockets had backlogs that were straining the system, and they needed experienced reviewers who could operate independently and produce work that held up to adversarial scrutiny. My rate increased to $120 per case. I renegotiated with the original county to match that rate. They agreed. Because that's what happens when you have something people need and they know it. By month 6, I was simultaneously completing my full-time work at DCFS and managing contracts with 3 county systems. I was earning more from case reviews alone than I'd earned at DCFS before the November the garbage bags appeared on my lawn. My savings account had $43 in it. I had rebuilt from 127 and 14 bags in the rain, a financial foundation that would take something far more significant than my mother's word to disturb. What I hadn't been watching, because I was too busy building, was what was happening to everyone else. The private investigator, Dennis Farrow, whose license number was displayed prominently on his company website, became the subject of a complaint filed with the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. The complaint originated from my mother, which I found out later, and contained the details she'd discovered after the fact. The inflated billing hours, the 6 fabricated dates, the failure to verify the nature of my hotel visits before constructing a report designed to confirm infidelity. His license was suspended pending investigation. The $800 she'd paid him was unrecoverable. No refund policy exists, it turns out, for private investigators who fabricate evidence, because they don't advertise that service, and clients don't tend to pursue them through channels that would require explaining why they'd hired them in the first place. Marcus, it emerged, had been borrowing from his father's dealership accounts. The word borrowing is doing significant work in that sentence, because the amounts were neither disclosed nor repaid. $3,000 here, $5,000 there. Incremental quantities designed to stay below the threshold of routine audits. The total accumulation over several years was $67. His father, during a standard quarterly review 8 months after our breakup, discovered discrepancies that his accountant identified as systematic rather than accidental. The dealership had an attorney on retainer. The attorney had an opinion about what $67 in undisclosed transfers constituted. Marcus's father had apparently loved his son very much up to the specific dollar figure at which family loyalty met financial obligation, and discovered that figure was somewhere below $67. The Lincoln Park apartment required $200 $400 monthly. Marcus, without my income supplementing his, couldn't cover it alone. He vacated and moved back to his parents' house in Naperville, at which point his parents were navigating their own legal situation, and the apartment's remaining lease liability transferred to the cosigner. My mother had co-signed to help us secure the place. 7 months of remaining lease at $2, $400 monthly came to $16,800. The landlord was not interested in negotiating. I didn't know any of this while it was happening. I was too busy working. 14 months after the night I slept with frost on the inside of my windows, a consulting firm that specialized in family law and court support services reached out through the county coordinator who'd first offered me the contracts. They were expanding their Illinois operations and needed someone to lead their case review division, training teams of reviewers, standardizing practices across multiple county systems, ensuring quality control at scale. The salary was $94 annually, plus benefits, plus performance bonuses tied to client satisfaction metrics. They had identified me specifically through the judges and attorneys who had been making note of my work for the past year. I accepted. I gave notice at DCFS, where I'd worked for 4 years, on a Monday morning. My supervisor took me to lunch at an Italian restaurant on Taylor Street and talked for most of the meal about the case I'd handled in my 3rd year. A family that had been in the system for 5 years before I'd written a report that restructured how the court understood the mother's history and changed the outcome for 2 kids who needed a different answer. She said I was the most resilient person she'd ever worked with. She said it like a fact, not a compliment, the way people say things they've been observing for a long time. I drove home that night through the West Loop, along the Chicago River, watching the city do its evening transition. The light changing on the water, the bridges, the skyline asserting itself against a sky going purple-gray over the lake. I'd been in this city for 7 years. I'd been through most of its neighborhoods by then, through different versions of my own life. I felt for the first time in 14 months. Like I was moving towards something rather than away from something. Like the direction had finally changed. That's when my mother's email arrived. It came to my old address, which I'd set to forward to my current one. A precaution that was also, I recognize now, a small act of hope. The email was 3 sentences. She needed to speak with me. It was important. Could we meet at the Starbucks on Armitage? The Starbucks on Armitage was in Lincoln Park, 3 blocks from the apartment. She'd chosen it the way people choose territory they know well. I suggested a different location. The conference room at my new office building in the West Loop, a glass-walled space on the 14th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, and, on clear days, a sightline that extended west toward Oak Park where she'd grown up. Tuesday at 10 a.m. My schedule was tight, I told her. I could give her 30 minutes. She confirmed within an hour, which told me something about where she was standing. I arrived 12 minutes early. I'd been there before. The building's lobby had good coffee, and I'd gotten in the habit of picking up an Americano on the way up to the 14th floor. I set up the conference room the way I set up for any client meeting. Leather portfolio open on the table, my phone face down, 2 water glasses filled. The Chicago River was doing its slow, determined thing below us. The city extended in every direction, gray and enormous and indifferent to the particular drama about to unfold in one of its glass boxes. My mother arrived at 10:04. She was wearing the same gray wool coat she'd been wearing the night she stood in the doorway and locked me out. I noticed that first, the coat. It could have been coincidence. It felt like something else. She looked smaller than I remembered. That's the first thing I thought, seeing her through the glass wall of the conference room as she followed the receptionist down the hallway. Smaller, and tired in a way that wasn't just that morning's tired. A longer exhaustion, something that had accumulated over months. She'd always carried herself with a particular erectness, my mother, a posture that announced certainty before she'd said a word. That posture was present but diminished, like a flag still flying in wind that had dropped. I had not allowed myself to imagine this meeting beyond its necessary logistics until I was actually in it. That was a kind of self-protection I'd developed over the previous 14 months, planning only as far forward as necessary, keeping attention on the work, on the immediate, on the thing in front of you that could be addressed with your current resources. Looking further had no utility when you were operating from a narrow base. But now the base was wide, and the woman I'd been most afraid to face was sitting in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building where people knew my name. And I was finding that the fear I'd spent a year carrying had not arrived with her. She looked at the room, at the Chicago River, at my portfolio, and the 2 glasses of water. I saw her cataloging, in the way she'd always cataloged, assessing, measuring, placing things in the hierarchy she'd been constructing her whole life. And I saw the moment she arrived at something that surprised her. The room fit me. The leather portfolio, the glass walls, the city spread out below. These were not decorations I'd borrowed. They were the natural environment of the work I'd built. She had expected, I think, to find me diminished. She had sent the investigator because she'd believed I was susceptible to ruin, and she had built her October and November on the premise that a woman who could be thrown out with garbage bags was a woman who could be reduced. What she found in this conference room was someone the room had been built around. I want to be honest. There was a moment, before she spoke, when I felt the old pull, the need for her approval, the desire for her to see me and be proud, which was the thing I'd wanted my entire childhood and never reliably received. That pull was real, and I recognized it, and I did not act on it. Recognizing a feeling is not the same as being governed by it. I'd learned that in graduate school, theoretically. I'd learned it for real in the 14 months since November. I stood when she came in. I didn't hug her. I indicated the chair across from me and waited while she settled herself and put her purse on the floor and looked around the room with the expression of someone cataloging their surroundings. "This is a nice office," she said. "Thank you," I said. What did you want to discuss? The directness landed differently than she'd expected. I could see her recalibrate. She'd prepared for something. A preamble, perhaps. Space to ease into it. I didn't give her space. She looked at her hands, then at me. I made a mistake, she said. I waited. I had learned from 7 years of social work and 14 months of rebuilding that silence is often the most powerful response available. People fill silence with what they actually mean to say. The investigator, he lied about what he found. He fabricated dates, he billed for hours he didn't work. He's lost his license. She paused. And Marcus? Her voice cracked at his name, which surprised me because I wouldn't have expected her to crack for Marcus. Then I understood. She wasn't cracking for him. She was cracking because he was the proof that her judgment had failed. He stole from his family. His father pressed charges. He's facing criminal prosecution. She looked at the table, at the Chicago River through the window, at me. I had to pay for the apartment after you left, 7 months of rent, $16,800. The amount landed in the room with weight. I thought... She stopped, started again. I thought I was protecting you from making a mistake. I thought Marcus was the right person for you and that you were going to ruin it. There was a long moment where I considered several responses. I considered the measured one, the professional one, the one that acknowledged her pain while making clear my own. I considered the one that let her believe we were moving toward something, because I knew she wanted that, because that's what she'd come here for. I considered the therapeutic one, the one that offered a framework. I looked at this woman who had known me for 29 years and had, on a November evening, stood in a doorway and told me I was exactly what she'd always suspected. A liar who couldn't keep her legs closed. I felt those words again, the way they'd arrived through my chest and through my hands going cold. I felt the frost on the inside of the car windows. I felt the 18 minutes in the Target parking lot with $79 in the balance. I felt the tampon I'd chosen over soup, and the protein bar, and the 12 minutes of crying that I'd allowed myself and then locked back down because I couldn't afford more than 12 minutes. And I felt, with absolute clarity, what I wanted to say. By hiring someone to prove I was a cheater? My voice was calm. I'd practiced this, not the words exactly, but the register, the absence of tremor, the presence of precision. By throwing me out without letting me speak? By telling everyone I was exactly what you said I was, a liar who couldn't keep her legs closed? She flinched. The flinch was visible, physical, a small recoil as the words came back to her through my mouth. Good. She should flinch. She should hear what those words sounded like from outside herself, from the mouth of the person they'd been used on. I want to make this right, she said. Her voice had lost some of its steadiness. I want us to be a family again. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about what she was actually asking. She was asking me to absorb the cost of what she'd done, to process her guilt, to offer her relief, to restore what she'd destroyed so that she could feel better about having destroyed it. She was asking me to perform the labor of forgiveness on a 14-month timeline that was convenient for her. I thought about what that would cost me. Not in theoretical terms, in actual terms, in what it would require me to revise about who I'd become, in what it would mean to re-enter a relationship that had operated, for my entire life, on terms that she had set. You can't afford what making it right would cost, I said. She blinked. The precision of it, not a rejection exactly, but something more surgical than rejection, a statement of fact that located the impossibility in her capacity rather than my willingness, landed in the room and sat there. But I appreciate you admitting the mistake, I added, because I meant it. Not warmly, not as a bridge toward reconciliation, but accurately. She had come here. She had said the words. That was something, measured in its exact dimensions. I stood. Our 30 minutes had become 12. She looked up at me from the chair, and she seemed, for a moment, genuinely uncertain. A woman who had spent 61 years being certain, finding herself in uncharted territory. "That's it?" she asked. "That's it," I said. I walked her to the elevator. We didn't hug. She pressed the lobby button and I watched the doors close, and then I went back to the conference room and stood at the window for a few minutes, watching the Chicago River, watching the city, breathing slowly in the way you breathe when something important has just been completed. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that because people always assume the satisfying moment is the anger moment, the raised voice, the dramatic speech. That's not what that 12-minute meeting was. It was something colder and more permanent than anger. It was the moment I stopped defining the relationship on her terms. She had spent my entire life as the arbiter of my worth, had raised me inside a system where her approval was the currency and her disapproval was the punishment. And I had just stood across a conference table from her and declined to participate in that system any further. The door had closed. It was done. And I felt, walking back to my office, something I'm not sure I'd ever felt before in relation to my mother. Completely, structurally free. Marcus pled guilty to embezzlement charges 4 months later. He received 18 months in Cook County Jail and 5 years probation. His father's dealerships removed his name from company documents, revised the succession plans, and issued a statement to their employee network about management restructuring that didn't mention him by name but left nothing unclear about the trajectory. The family business that had funded European vacations and downtown restaurant reservations and an engagement ring that required its own insurance policy survived him by making him someone who no longer existed within it. His mother called me once in the weeks before sentencing, asking if I would write a character letter to the judge. She was careful and polished on the phone, the way people are when they're asking for something they know they don't deserve. She emphasized that whatever had happened between Marcus and me, I knew him as a person, and character letters from people outside the immediate family carried weight with judges. I told her I was familiar with how character letters worked in sentencing hearings. I declined to write one. My mother's social circle, the women she'd moved through for 30 years, book clubs, yoga classes, fundraising committees, the particular social web of a 61-year-old woman in a Chicago suburb who had built her identity around her community standing, slowly, one conversation at a time, began to understand what had actually happened. The shelter in Schaumburg, the resume workshops, the fabricated investigation, the 6 invented dates. Some of the women apologized directly. Most of them simply stopped mentioning it, which is the way embarrassment moves through social systems. It doesn't announce its departure. It just gradually stops showing up. My mother, I heard through my Aunt Marguerite, her younger sister, who had always been the quieter and more generous of the two, stopped attending her regular Thursday book club, stopped going to the yoga studio she'd been a member of for 11 years. The embarrassment, apparently, was not the small private kind, but the architectural kind. The kind that affects how you move through space because you don't know who knows, and you don't know what they're thinking. And the uncertainty becomes its own form of confinement. She had orchestrated what she believed would be my exposure. She'd spent $800 on fabricated evidence, weaponized our social circle, stood in a doorway and said the worst thing she'd ever said to me, and watched the consequences radiate outward. What she hadn't calculated, what I suspect she had genuinely not considered, was that consequences don't stay contained to the person you direct them at. They move, they expand, they find their way back. I didn't gloat. I want to be clear about that too. The version of this story where I tracked the collapse, attended to it with satisfaction, made sure I had front row seats, that's not what happened. I was too busy building something that didn't require her to exist. The collapse was peripheral to me. It was happening in a life I was no longer living, to relationships I was no longer maintaining, in a social structure I had departed. I heard about it through my aunt, and through the occasional piece of information that filtered through connections I still maintained, and I registered it as information rather than triumph. Something had gotten what it deserved. That was complete in itself. It didn't need me to watch. The consulting firm promoted me twice in the first 18 months. I built their Illinois case review operation from scratch, hired and trained 12 reviewers, developed the quality standards, established relationships with court administrators in 7 counties. They expanded my oversight to Indiana and Wisconsin within the year. I was presented at a statewide social work conference as part of a panel on innovation in family court support services. I spoke for 20 minutes to a room of 300 practitioners, and afterward had a line of people who wanted to ask questions about the methodology. I live in a loft in Wicker Park now, on a quiet block where you can hear the neighborhood on weekend mornings, kids on bikes, dogs, the sound of someone's record player through an open window. The apartment has exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows, and a ceiling height that makes the space feel like an exhale. I furnished it slowly, deliberately. A velvet sofa in deep blue, a dining table that seats 8, art from local galleries, a print from a young artist in Pilsen, a photograph from a woman I met at a Logan Square gallery opening who shot Chicago neighborhoods in the early morning when the light is different than it is any other time. My savings account has $127,000 in it. My retirement account is fully funded. These are numbers that sound like they should feel like revenge and don't. They feel like foundation. They feel like, this is mine. This was built from the ground up by my own hands, during the months when no one who knew me believed in me, from $127.14 garbage bags and a skill set that existed before anyone attacked it and survived after everyone tried to discount it. The shelter program in Schaumburg, the one my mother's investigator had photographed me entering on 11 Tuesdays and Thursdays, asked me to join their board of directors in the second year of my consulting work. I said yes without hesitation. We've expanded since then to 3 locations across Chicago: Schaumburg, Humboldt Park, and a new site in Englewood. We served 890 women last year. They came from everywhere and nowhere, from relationships that had spent years convincing them they were worth nothing, and they arrived with what they could carry and needed someone to show them what they still had. At one of our first board meetings in the expanded Humboldt Park site, I sat across from a woman named Carmen, who had come through the original Schaumburg program 2 years before my board appointment. She was on the board now too, a peer advocate, someone who had moved through the shelter's services and then stayed to help other women navigate them. She was 34, precise in her speech, the way people become precise when they've had to learn to make every word count. At a break between agenda items, she leaned over and said, in a voice too quiet for the rest of the room, "I heard you used to volunteer here, before everything." She said it without elaboration, which meant she knew more than the official version. "I did," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "I was here the same time as you, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons." I thought about that. I hadn't known individual participants. We'd been careful about confidentiality, about professional distance, but the timeline aligned. She had been in those resume workshops. She had been one of the women sitting across a table from me, while a private investigator photographed the building from a parking lot, and my mother waited for the report. "You helped me fix my resume," she said. "The job I got from that resume is the one I still have." I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. The ironies were too nested, too complete. A private investigator had documented my presence at a shelter as evidence of infidelity. The actual evidence of what I'd been doing there was sitting across from me on a board of directors, employed, stable, running a peer advocacy program that had supported 63 women in the previous 12 months. I know something about that arrival. Every time I train new case reviewers, and I've trained many by now, I tell them the same thing. Not as inspiration, but as operational fact. Your value isn't determined by who believes in you. It's determined by what you can do when everyone stops believing. Competence is the only currency that never devalues. Sometimes I drive past the Lincoln Park apartment. It's a different life there now. A young couple, their bicycles on the porch, plants in the window. I feel nothing when I see it, and the nothing is not numbness. It's the nothing of genuine completion. That apartment was a chapter, and the chapter ended, and the story continued. And what came after was better, structurally and fundamentally better, than anything that apartment represented. I drove past it on a Thursday evening in late autumn, about 2 years after everything happened. The light was the same November light, that flat gray the city makes before the first real snow. I was on my way back from a meeting in Wicker Park, not thinking about it, and the route just took me past. The blazer bag had long since been retrieved and the blue blazer dry cleaned and returned to a hanger. The other 13 bags had been unpacked, their contents folded into drawers and closets in the Albany Park room, and then again in the Ravenswood apartment, and then again in the Wicker Park loft. Every item had found a new home. Nothing had been permanently lost. The things that had been in those bags were with me still, including, somewhere in the back of my closet, the blazer my mother had once told me looked put together. I keep it, not for sentimentality, for accuracy. My mother sends birthday cards. I don't respond. She is entitled to her regret. It is hers to carry in whatever form it takes. I am not obligated to receive it on her timeline or transform it into something she can use. The cards sit unopened for a week and then I throw them away. Not with anger, with the same administrative efficiency I bring to anything that doesn't require my attention. It is the most honest thing I can offer her at this point. The truth that her words have the same weight as junk mail, and that I've finally stopped organizing my life around trying to make them weigh more. I built this life from 127 and 14 garbage bags on a November lawn in Chicago. I built it in a car with frost on the inside of the windows. I built it at a Starbucks on Clark Street, nursing a small coffee for 3 hours while I wrote case review reports that judges would eventually request by name. I built it in the 4 hours of sleep between a full-time job and a freelance career that became, eventually, the only career. I built it without anyone who was supposed to believe in me believing in me. Without my mother. Without Marcus. Without the 23 people who canceled their coffee dates and didn't ask for my side. No one can take it from me. That's not a threat or a declaration. It's just the mathematical truth of something built on a foundation that was always yours. My mother tried to reduce me to nothing and accidentally proved that I'd never needed her at all. I was the foundation. I had always been the foundation. She'd removed the scaffolding, and the scaffolding was the only thing her architecture had ever built. I don't know what she does with the birthday cards she sends, the ones I don't answer. Whether she keeps them or whether they disappear. Whether she writes them with hope or with the diminished expectations of someone who has learned finally where the limits of her authority actually are. I don't think about it much. I have cases to review, reviewers to train, a board meeting at the shelter next Thursday, a flight to Indianapolis for a client consultation on Friday morning. The Chicago winter is coming again. You can feel it in the lake air, that particular advance notice the city gives, a sharpening, an intake of breath. I dress for it now the same way I always have. I lean into it. I keep moving. People who have lost everything and rebuilt it develop a different relationship with cold. It can't surprise you the same way twice. Here is what I want you to carry from this story, because there is something here that extends beyond one woman and one November in Chicago. Studies on resilience, specifically what researchers call post-traumatic growth, consistently show that the greatest rebuilding doesn't happen despite destruction. It happens because of it. Being forced from a structure you relied on is, paradoxically, one of the most reliable triggers for discovering what you are actually capable of. Not because suffering is good, it isn't, but because competence is often invisible to us when it's embedded in systems designed by other people. It takes the removal of those systems to reveal what was always yours. Psychologists who study family estrangement and enmeshment find that children raised in households where approval was conditional often have no reliable internal measure of their own worth, they've outsourced that measurement to the person who conditioned them. The journey toward reclaiming it is rarely chosen willingly. It's usually forced by exactly the kind of crisis this story describes. The crisis doesn't create the value. The crisis reveals it. And once revealed, once you've seen clearly what you can do when there is nothing left but you, that knowledge doesn't leave. You carry it into every room you enter afterward. You carry it the way you carry something that was always yours, and you just finally know where you put it. If this story moved something in you, if you felt the cold of that November car, or the relief of that Albany Park bedroom, or the precision of that 12-minute conference room meeting, hit the like button below. It helps more people find stories like this one. Leave a comment. Have you ever had to rebuild from nothing? Have you ever watched something you'd been told you needed turn out to be the thing that was limiting you? Tell me where you're watching from, whether you're here in Chicago, somewhere else in the Midwest, or on the other side of the country entirely. I read everything. If you're not subscribed yet, the button is right there. This channel is where stories like this one live, and there are more of them every week. And the video playing on your screen right now? Don't skip it. The next story involves a woman who discovered at a family dinner that her in-laws had been orchestrating something for 3 years right under her nose. And what she found when she finally started asking the right questions will change how you think about the people who smile at your face. That one is waiting for you. Don't make it wait long.